Okay, so for the recording, we'll start with how to do market analysis. So how do you guys just, I mean, instinctually, how do you guys think we go about doing market analysis? What do you think it entails? How would you start even getting an idea of getting started with a market analysis?
So is it after the
shock? Yes, suppose it's either before or after a shock.
I'd probably start with some research to see if any other organizations have done a market analysis. Or the government has a lot of data on that already done.
Yeah, so secondary data, that's a good point. What else? And what kind of things would you look for in secondary data?
Probably like the main commodities, or like what is this economy about? Is it mainly crops? Is there a lot of services? Just what the commodities or services are.
Yeah, and that's a good point, Amy. Like one, you are looking at available secondary resources, and something you mentioned that's important is that when we're doing market analysis, we're not just doing a market analysis on kind of just everything that's available in the market, right? Because there's so many, you know, you can think of a million food products, so many shelter products, so many hygiene products. So we have to kind of start thinking a little bit high level, you know, what commodity are we going to study? Is it, you know, CGI? Is it going to be beans, oil, rice, soap? And that, you know, you might choose that commodity on a high level just kind of based on what you're seeing has been impacted and also what you may anticipate your objective is in terms of your intervention, right? So if you're thinking about maybe a shelter objective, then you might want to start looking at commodities related to, you know, again, roofing material, supplies, building supplies, right? And then we're also looking at simply collecting information again about supply, demand, price, volume, power, access to these goods. So like any, you know, like any analysis, it's just about obtaining the information and then using that to inform a little bit of our analysis, our thinking about what is this data telling us, right? And the way we obtain that information can be through secondary data. It can also be directly by talking to consumers, producers, wholesalers, so understanding, you know, how that commodity or product has been affected from their perspective or from their, you know, from their point of view. And generally speaking, when we're looking, we'll talk a little bit about the Red Cross tools for market analysis, but generally speaking, when we're looking at market analysis, we're asking or looking into things like, do market actors behave competitively? Are markets integrated? And we're going to look at this further on, what we mean by all this. What is the capacity of local traders to respond to changes in demand, right? What are the impacts or anticipated impacts of the shock on the market system? Do the impacts primarily affect supply, demand, or both? And what kind of macro level factors may influence the capacity to, the market capacity to respond to an emergency? So when we think about these questions, you know, again, we're falling back to like data that will help us answer these questions. So in terms of which market systems should we assess, should the assessment focus on or where? Again, this might depend on your anticipated objective for your intervention. If you know you're going on with and your geographic area where you're focusing on, right? So if you, for example, in Ecuador, there was three main communities that were affected by the earthquake a couple of years back, 2 years ago. So you're not going to look at the entire country, right? You'll focus your geographic scope in those three areas and then understand the markets in those areas. You might be in a situation where we're working with a lot of humanitarian actors, and you will all cover, you know, you'll agree on a common market assessment, and everyone will cover a geographic area within that market assessment. And you might decide if, you know, in the Philippines, say after Typhoon Yolanda, I think it was World Vision actually did a RAM assessment, which is a Red Cross movement tool. And they looked at two food items. So they looked at, I believe, sardines and rice. They looked at one hygiene item, soap, and they looked at shelter at CGI. And so for each of these items, they looked at they looked at the market system for these items, and then developed market maps and market flow maps for each of these items to understand, who are the actors involved in the movement of these items, and how are these items moving, who are moving them as well. So who are the market actors? When we're thinking about, do market actors behave competitively? Is there just one or two of these the traders in a geographic area, or are there many available? How do they set prices? What are the observed impacts of the shock on the market? So are there changes in prices? Are there changes in the amount of supply, the volume? And also in terms of the capacity of local traders to respond to changes in demand, right? So again, if we are gonna do a cash intervention and we anticipate that people are really gonna buy, a bunch of food items, are the traders and physical marketplaces, are they able to obtain those goods in time? Or are we gonna inject a bunch of money and then we're gonna run out of goods because there's a lag time in supply, right? And then again, macro level factors that are influencing the capacity to respond to the emergencies. So if there's issues with storage facilities, right? So for example, again, using the example of fish market, if refrigeration units have been damaged, then that limits how much, fish you can store and keep. If there's issues with transportation, whether that's road access or change in gasoline prices or just vehicles that have been damaged, that all is going to influence, again, how this market chain moves. Any questions? Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
We'll take one question from Zoom and then we'll go with you, Eva.
Yeah, so Roxanne was asking if we have examples of completed rapid assessment of market assessments, and I know that there was one in Nepal. Is that something that do you have one, Mariana, that you could share that you know of?
Yeah, I have one for the Philippines, for Ecuador, and I believe there's also one for Nepal, but also I think if you can also just, Google the market assessment and the disaster, and usually in that humanitarian ID webpage, they will have the kind of, if it was a completed market assessment and shared, they will share that. But I'm happy to share the two that I definitely know I have available, just so you can see. And the one that World Vision conducted in the Philippines with our Red Cross movement tool, it's actually, I find it really helpful because, again, if you're in a situation where you're supporting the use of this tool or going to implement this tool, then it's helpful to kind of have a completed example or reference to see how they conducted it. And I thought it was very well done. And Eva, you had a question as well?
Yeah, I was curious, like on average, how long it would take to conduct one of these assessments and kind of what the scope and like how many people are involved. And also if you could speak to like what level of like certainty you have with the assessment, like how accurate does it need to be for you kind of to act on that assessment moving forward?
Okay, those are both great questions. So how long it takes, we'll talk about this in a little bit more detail when we talk about the market tool, but I'll just give you kind of the preview that at least for the Red Cross movement in terms of market tools, we have the RAM, which is meant to be a quick tool immediately after a disaster, so you can get a quick picture of what's happening. So, it could take up to, depending on your kind of, again, geographic area, just 3 days to complete possibly. But again, just kind of more operationally and realistically, it will just also depend on the number of resources that you have available, right? If it's just you with 2 or 3 volunteers, it might be harder to cover, the different areas and talk to different people and then put all that analysis together. If you have a bigger team, then it might be easier to do that. But the RAM is meant to be a kind of shorter, quicker market analysis. And then there's some, not just from the Red Cross movement, but other market tools that are meant to be more in-depth market assessments to not just guide kind of an immediate response intervention, but the entire kind of project cycle and looking at markets not just 2 to 4 weeks out, but 6 months out, and those might take a little longer. So that's kind of just a general range. But again, talking about emergency context, it will also, again, you could do it in as little as 3 days or 2 weeks, but also remember that we're not necessarily the only actors playing a role in the intervention. So usually in big disasters, there will be kind of not necessarily a cluster group, but a working group, a cash working group. And good practice and good for coordination is to kind of agree with that cash working group to conduct that study together or that assessment together, and kind of divide and conquer that way. So that was something that we did in Dominica. WFP put forth their market assessment, and then we all said, okay, we're going to use this tool and divide and conquer. And a couple of people went to one part of the island, and a couple of people to the west, south, and then brought all that data together and put it forth. It still took some time, but it's a way when you have limited resources also to kind of leverage that coordination. And in terms
this
of,
is Jenny.
Yeah.
Sorry, go ahead.
No, go. If you were, I was also going to talk to the certainty part of Ava's question.
Yep.
But you can go ahead first if you want to go ahead.
No, go ahead.
In terms of the certainty, I will say, a lot of these tools and a lot of this analysis, you're not meant to be like an economics, microeconomics expert, right? But it really is about just getting good data. So not just, using a report from 5 years ago and saying, well, the markets function. It's about having kind of, think about the good enough approach of having sufficient, we've talked to people. We've not just talked to them, but we've triangulated the data. So if I'm hearing about, people saying that prices have increased, I've gone and verified it myself. I've checked it with multiple sources. I've, so and the tools that we have available kind of help you triangulate that data. So I would say after, talking to consumers, to producers, to retailers, you're really getting all those pieces of information that will kind of repeat themselves. So that gives you the certainty. And you're also talking again to other humanitarian actors saying, are you hearing the same? Are you seeing the same? Are you thinking that this is kind of the same? Is your market analysis showing the same situation? Jenny?
Yes. So the other thing that I mentioned, the word accurate, and is information accurate? And I think that generally the information is accurate. The question is, how precise does it need to be? And that's where this good enough approach comes in. So we are not trying to build a PhD thesis. We're trying to inform a rapid emergency response. So again, good enough. It's not we do want accuracy. We do want to know whether or not traders have the capacity to respond to an increase in demand if we plan to be injecting a lot into the demand side, or whether or not an injection on the supply side might cause difficulty. We do need to be accurate in that sense, but we don't need to be extremely precise.
And it is a fine balance. Again, that example in Dominica, when we kind of worked with different organizations, we all did the market analysis and then, kind of helped with the analysis. But by the time that report was out on the market situation in Dominica, that was probably like 2 months after the disaster hit. And some organizations were waiting for that report to even start interventions, right? Like, so that one, it kind of defeats the purpose, because 2 months after you've done your primary data collection, that situation probably has changed, right? So we as the Red Cross movement, we kind of, looked at high level, like, yeah, we're contributing to this market analysis, but we're also going to just quickly look at, are stores open? Do they have supply? Do they say they can meet supply? Can people access those stores? And that's going to be our good enough data to move forward with an intervention. So it's kind of striking that fine balance. Okay, So when we already talked a little bit about choosing market systems, and we'll go into that further again when we revisit the market map. So again, when we're talking about supply and demand, again, we want to see supply, what, can traders, can people produce the goods that are needed in the quantities that are needed? How much time will it take to get those goods? How many actors are present who are selling a given good, right? And in terms of consumers, do people have the purchasing power to buy that given good, to buy rice, beans, oil? How are we seeing any changes in supply and demand, right? And again, we've talked, why does it matter? Because if suppliers can't respond to demand, that's going to change our prices, or vice versa, right? And we're going to do a little exercise with this later, so I'll just cover it briefly. We talked when we were talking about some of kind of the high level questions about market integration. It's again, looking at the linkages between local, regional, and national markets, and alternative suppliers who can step in case a market is affected. So how do we look at this? Is looking at the different prices between two markets, factoring for transportation, the price pattern over time, trends in comparable emergencies. But why is market integration important? Because it makes markets less vulnerable to kind of price changes, right? So I like to think about it as like there's kind of a backup system available, or there's just internal competition, right? So it's not like there's just this dependency on this one market. If a certain market is affected, well, look, there's another lower market system that's coming in to offset that. Does that make sense? Then when we think about market competitiveness, it just talks about, the existence of a sufficient number of traders so that there is no kind of single dependency on one sole enterprise that dominates the market. And again, this is important because if we have a competitive market, then there's, again, less risk of price distortion, right? There's more players involved. There's also less risk of just market being completely disrupted, right? Because, again, it's taking away that dependency on there's only one supplier of this good versus, even if a couple of suppliers were affected, there's 80% of them are still functioning, are still working, not functioning, but are still capable of providing a certain good, right? So market competition is something that we can look at, and we can look at the number of traders or markets available who sell a given good. Then another thing we look at is inflation. And inflation is something that typically, people get really worried about, or say, you have to do your market assessment so that we don't cause inflation or we don't produce inflation. And it's important to understand what we mean by inflation, because kind of strictly speaking, when we use the term inflation, it's just kind of the country level inflation, right? It's just a kind of, generally speaking, the overall price of goods has increased. And then we talk about kind of relative price inflation. So goods may kind of, depending on seasonality, on just general demand and supply, might, increase in price or decrease in price. So mainly the point of this slide is to say, or this is to tell you, one, don't use the word inflation loosely. So when prices increase, don't say, oh, we have inflation, because that doesn't just necessarily mean that just because prices have increased, there's inflation, kind of over a longer period of time, and looking at more factors. And think about, even if outside of kind of thinking of inflation itself, think about how much how price increases can impact your intervention. So how do you think that affects your intervention or your population? So how would, if you're noticing increase in prices, how does that affect either how you plan your intervention, or how does that affect the affected people or non-affected people?
Well, it means that they may not be able to afford what they need.
Yeah, and in terms of your intervention?
I'm going to pass.
So it just means, yeah, so if prices are increasing, it might just mean that, something that I was able to get before for a certain price, might be a little more expensive. I might not be able to afford it. But again, this doesn't mean that it's important to understand kind of when we're looking at changes in price. What is the change? Maybe what's causing the change? How much is the change in price? And also, it doesn't mean that we're not going to do our intervention because prices have changed. It just means that we have to plan for this, right? So maybe people are saying that price of certain food items have increased, right? So when we are thinking, if we, for example, we were planning for a cash intervention, then when we're giving money, we're gonna into our calculation, we're gonna factor in the fact that price has gone up. We also have to think about, well, maybe it was just a temporary spike in the immediate aftermath of a disaster, and then it'll go, it'll normalize, right? So that's something to keep in mind, like what we anticipate is going to happen as well, or what we understanding kind of the cause of that. And then also understanding if there's an actual price increase, or whether it's a perceived price increase. So in Ecuador, after the earthquake, we were talking to some people in the affected areas, and a lot of people kept on saying that the price of Coca-Cola had increased, right? So we're like, this is kind of weird because we've only heard this about Coca-Cola and not everything else. And they were saying that it was a result of the disaster. And then we looked at it further, and it was correct that the price of Coca-Cola had increased, but it was because of some tax that the government had put on it maybe 2 months before the earthquake. But I think people felt it more strongly after the earthquake, which is why, in their mind, it was kind of a result of the earthquake. So again, just kind of important to triangulate and kind of look at that data and look at, well, why only one product and not others, understand that market system. Jenny, not sure if you want to add anything here?
No, that sounds fine.
Perfect. Okay, another thing to think about is the scale of our intervention, right? How much cash are we actually injecting into a local economy? And again, this is something that sometimes there's that fear that we will cause inflation with a cash intervention. And that, I'll give you an example of the Philippines and Nepal, where the Red Cross movement targeted about 50,000 households, 40,000 households, between 40 to 50,000 households with about $100 to $150 per household. And, in the grand scheme of things, when you look at the entire population of those countries, that's a drop in the bucket, right? So that's not going to cause inflation. But also looking at that, are you dispersing even the cash you're injecting in a larger geographical area, or are you concentrating in one small geographical area and injecting a lot of cash? Are you targeting everyone, or are you just targeting a percentage of the population, right? So these are things that you can start looking at and understanding to see what kind of impact you're going to have on the market. Questions, comments, thoughts? And again, we talked about this briefly when we're dealing with price changes, kind of understanding how these price changes are working and what's the cause of these, right? So is it something that's predictable? Is there certain goods that are more expensive at certain times of the month because they're off season and then less expensive when they're in season? Or is it something that is a spike in a price that we don't really know what the cause is? So just knowing what the prices are and understanding and communicating that clearly internally to inform your planning, and also sensitizing beneficiaries regarding changes in value of prices, right? Okay. So just to kind of bring it back together, again, just a reminder we talked about our market system map. So how do we kind of visualize all this data together? Usually, this is from the RAM tool that the Red Cross movement has. When we draw a market map, so here, this is an example of a wheat market system in normal times. So again, we have our market actors here in the market chain. So we have small farmers, bigger farmers, importers, exporters. Again, the arrows symbolize just kind of the relationship, how this product moves between each of the market actors. The quantity here is meant to symbolize metric tons. So how many metric tons are being passed on, and then just the relationship with the different actors. And then N is just kind of an approximation of how many small farmers there are, how many bigger farmers. So about, 3 importers, exporters, 200 bigger farmers, and about 10,000 smaller farmers, right? And so these are the infrastructure services that are affecting or influencing our markets, so formal banks, transportation, storage, and I believe this is informal credit. And then land property rights, natural environment resources, trade laws and enforcement, social norms and informal networks, and consumption trends and preferences. So this is kind of a pre-disaster view of this market system. Now, when we look at the post-disaster view, what are we seeing? So usually I'm going to minimize this slightly so you guys can see the key here. Typically, when these market maps are drawn post-disaster, so the key here symbolizes like this is an effect on external factors. So there was some shock here, and some shock in terms of informal social norms and informal networks. When there's a X along one of the lines, which in this case, we can see that there is an X between district traders and rural traders. That means that the market, it's totally affected. There was a complete disruption here. So something has stopped the movement of wheat from the district traders to the rural traders. And then we can see in different areas that there's kind of partially affected parts of our market system, right? And as we're drawing kind of our post-disaster or post-shock market system map, we're also noticing the changes in how the goods are moving in terms of volume and prices, right? So previously there was, between small farmers and local mills, we were moving about 2,000 metric tons of wheat, and now that has decreased by about 40%. Between bigger farmers and large flour millers, that has decreased about 40%. We can see that there's a price increase between urban retailers and urban populations. So, well, we didn't have prices here before, but this will indicate that there's an increase in price, right? So this allows us to see when we're talking again about market-based intervention, this allows us to see what parts of the market are affected, right? So in this case, by understanding that where there's affectation, we could possibly look into, why is this completely disrupted? Why are district traders unable to source their rural retailers, right? To rural retailers. And again, without having all the kind of, and not to say that this is, you should base all your analysis on a market map. So obviously your market map is informed by a lot of data, and this is just a summary of what's happening. But, maybe an assumption just looking at right now as a market map here is that perhaps because district traders look like they were partially affected by transport facilities and storage facilities. So maybe that was slightly affected. And so maybe they're only going to prioritize or provide goods, wheat to the urban retailers, and they're unable to do this for the rural retailers, right? Perhaps because they might not have enough goods or because transportation to these rural retailers is damaged. So this way you can kind of have an overview of kind of your entire market system and where there might be either fractures or complete disruption. Any questions on this?
But in this case, you had the market map before the shock and then after. I mean, how often obviously you're not going to know to go in and do a market map before the shock happens. Yeah. How would you build that then?
So it doesn't matter. I mean, a good practice is to try and always do kind of market pre-shock market assessments. And even that, I would say I don't want to call it a long shot. It's still good to have that information. But, you might have done a market assessment on beans and then with the post-shock, you're studying wheat, right? But regardless, post-shock, like just being able, doing this post-disaster is not going to change how you map this out. It's simply going to show you, you're going to know, these are the market actors. You're still going to know that. You're still going to know how they interact. And so you are able to draw where there's, where they've been affected. So I can, and typically how we've done this is, or how my experience with this, which is, still limited. It's not like I've done many of these, but, we will talk to farmers, we'll talk to millers, we'll talk to district traders and kind of ask, okay, who do you sell to? Who do you get this product from? And so we'll start kind of painting that picture and then seeing, okay, this is how it worked in normal times. Okay, what's happened now after the disaster? Where are those bottlenecks? Where are those struggles, right? So it's simply, you're still getting that picture painted and then understanding what the situation was before or after.
So you're asking people after the shock, what was it like before the shock? That's how you're getting the pre-shock data?
You're asking what it was before and after the shock.
Yeah, this is Jenny. I can just fill in on that. So everything you said's great. And the thing I would add is that when you're working on emergency response and you are in the process of understanding your context and doing your assessment and getting your situation analysis and your market assessment analysis, you need to know what things were like before in order to be able to appreciate how much is needed. So you can't answer the question of how much you need to give well unless you understand how much has been lost. And you don't understand how much has been lost or what's missing or what the gap is unless you know both the before and the after. So you can build a pre-crisis map as a part of your post-crisis disaster assessment. It is entirely doable, and you would want to. And you need that information not just to answer the how much question, but also because it's an advocacy tool. You can't, in order to be able to communicate why it's so important to do what you're proposing to do, you need to be able to say, well, before people were able to do this and now they can't because. And so those questions about before and after, some of the most important assessment questions that you can ask.
Yeah, and so again, just to when you're doing this in kind of practice, just because, maybe you're talking to a couple of district traders and they're telling you, well, we no longer supply to rural traders after the shock or after the disaster. That kind of gives you an inkling, and this is where you kind of have to dig deeper and say, well, okay, this means that you used to supply to rural retailers, but because of the shock, you can no longer do that, right? So the only difference now is that you're representing, okay, before shock, you were able to do this, you supplied about 2,000 metric tons, and then post-shock, something's happened, you're no longer able to supply. So you don't necessarily, you could possibly, maybe even from, again, secondary data, have an idea of how things worked beforehand, but as Jenny said, as you're conducting your interviews, you're observing things, you're assessing kind of the before and after.
I'm sorry, may I interject one more thing?
Yeah.
So the other thing that you're trying to do when you're doing your assessment and your situation analysis, you're trying to say, okay, so how am I going to respond? You need to be able to understand how the shock resulted in the current situation, and you need to understand the market context so that you can make a projection about how you expect the context to be by the time you're doing your intervention. So this aspect of seasonality, which would be a normal time changes over time, but also just temporality in general, is extremely important because otherwise you're assuming that if you don't take it into account, then you're assuming that 4 weeks from now, everybody's still going to be in the same situation they were today. And when you're talking about a post-disaster situation, that's probably a bad assumption to make. So you need to take into account the fact that markets recover, people change, people try to find a way around things, people want to make money. And so things are going to change. So this aspect of temporality is extremely important, and we don't really give it enough credit in our assessment and analysis and project design processes. Over.
Yeah, and Ava, you had a question?
So just a quick question. In the context of CTP, would you go as far as to support like the transport facilities and storage facilities, or that might be kind of disrupting market forces, like all the way out to infrastructure?
You could. I think a key thing to note is that this alone is not going to inform your intervention. This is going to be one of many things you consider. But looking at this, you might say, well, you know, maybe I'm going to design an intervention to address kind of the issues with the partial disruption with storage facilities and transport facilities. That being said, so this kind of may influence that, but there's other factors that you have to consider in terms of the intervention you're gonna put forth, right? If you're working with, when you're working with a local national society in a different country, you know, what are their strengths? What are the kind of the areas that they want to focus on as well? Are we the best positioned player to support transport facilities or storage facilities, or do we support a different part of, you know, of the market system? What are other actors doing, right? So yeah, this kind of helps you think about the possible interventions areas, but it's not kind of the sole factor deciding what you're gonna address. Does that make sense? Okay, so we are gonna do, just to kind of, I know we've kind of talked a lot about kind of theory in terms of, you know, data and what this data can tell us. So we're just gonna try and put this into a little bit of practice in terms of supply and demand and thinking about what's, you know, painting a picture about what's happening. So we have here a situation with blankets. So after an earthquake, despite the evident needs of the cold and miserable population, traders report that the number of blankets being purchased has not risen much above normal. Staff observed that the price of blankets, which are manufactured in a neighboring unaffected region, has more than doubled. The traders blame higher transport costs. Okay, so thinking about this, what's happening to supply? It's the same, or we don't know, right? Yeah, seems like it's the same. What about demand? It's increasing. What makes you think it's increasing? The population is cold and miserable. But well, just because they're cold and miserable, but does it tell you we don't know if they're actually seeking out blankets, right? So it just tells you what their situation is, but not necessarily whether they're asking or requesting blankets, right? So what about go ahead, Matthew.
It looks like supply has stayed the same, but demand has gone down because the price has gone up.
Okay, and then you mentioned prices. So the price, what happened to the price? It's more than doubled, and what do we think is causing this price increase? Transportation costs, right? So when we look at this supply, I mean, again, this is not that you're going to draw all these conclusions from this one paragraph. You have to look at the bigger picture. But just based on this, you know, we see demand, no change, or we don't have any report change. Supply, we don't necessarily see if we don't really have information. Price has more than doubled, and transportation costs has increased, right? So demand might be normal or strong. The supply response is unknown. This may indicate that possibly there may be possible supply constraints, maybe severe, right? Because if the price has more than doubled for transportation, then, you know, the traders might be getting less blankets. So again, this is just kind of, as you're getting information on the situation, how to start kind of breaking it down. We'll go to the next prompt, sorghum. So in a rural food insecure region whose population receives regular food aid distribution, agricultural production is falling. Sorghum farmers seem to be abandoning production, and in interviews they complain that persistently low prices are to blame. So what's happening with supply here?
A lot of supply.
Yeah, I mean, actually, that's an interesting response. I was thinking about it. Well, let's continue. Okay, so you said there's a lot of supply, and you said Matt said it's decreasing, right? Okay, demand? Or what assumption can we make about demand? Why would you say that demand is decreasing?
Because they're getting regular food for
Yeah, so there.
you know, supply usually when it's like food, or is it supply of their agricultural products versus
Supply of their agriculture, of the sorghum, right, of their food aid. So yeah, and what about price? It's decreasing, right? So supply, again, I made the assumption it's decreasing because, you know, they seem to be abandoning production. So supply is decreasing. The demand assumption that it's decreasing because they're getting some of these food, or they're probably getting sorghum through food distribution, and price is decreasing, right? So again, buyers lack ability or willingness to pay, or may be leaving the market, right? Try another one. Building materials. So a tsunami has devastated a coastal zone, destroying homes, but sparing the factories where people work. Traders report a surge in sales of timber and roofing sheets as people rebuild, and are stepping up imports of these goods. However, residents complain that prices are much higher than before, so that many simply cannot afford to reconstruct shelter. So are there any issues with supply here? Okay, you guys are saying it doesn't seem to be. Why doesn't it seem to be like there's issues with supply? The factories weren't affected, and people are stepping up imports, right? So it seems like there's supply. What about demand? It's increasing, and what about, yeah, surge in sales, and what about price? Yeah, so in this case, we're saying supply, there seems to be no constraints. Demand, because of the affected homes, it looks like there's surge in sales, so there's an increasing demand, and prices have also increased. So, you know, it could be, you know, the market system is performing well, but the high prices could suggest that there may be some bottleneck, right? So even though factories are producing, they said that they were stepping up import of goods, right? So there may be either a bottleneck or something there that might be causing prices to increase.
So can you also assume that because it's such in high demand, that retailers see an opportunity, that there's no bottleneck, they just know that people will pay higher prices?
Yeah, it could be. It could also be that. So this is not to say that you need to draw all the conclusions from this one sentence, but this exactly like the questions you're asking and the thinking you're doing is exactly what you should be doing when you're getting your data and analyzing, right? Is this, you know, is it really that there's, you know, a bottleneck in the system, or could it be that just, you know, the traders are taking advantage and know there's a need and they're, you know, hiking up prices?
So
in that situation, would you go and talk to the manufacturers and see why prices are so high, or would you try and take a kind of neutral approach and not do to like direct interviews or whatever?
So it depends. There's a couple of different things you could do. I mean, if it's kind of in a smaller geographic region, maybe what you want to do is maybe do a voucher-based program and agree with the traders on set prices so that, you know, they don't increase or decrease, or you can definitely, regardless of what happens, you can get a set amount of goods for that voucher. If it's kind of a relative small increase, then you could still do kind of actual cash distribution, but include that increase in your cash transfer value. And as Jenny said, again, understand, is this kind of a temporary increase? Is this going to be an increase that's going to last for a while? Like what kind of also be able to project what you anticipate is going to happen. Jenny, you were going to add something?
Yeah, I think sometimes we see price increases and then kind of try to point fingers, so the traders are taking advantage, right? Right. So and sometimes that happens, but one of the things that you're trying to, that you should be able to understand about your market when you're doing your intervention is this goes to the question of the degree of competitiveness. So if you have enough traders in a market, more than a few, more than say 3 or 4, then it would be very difficult for those traders to collude to be able to increase their prices together in a way that would take advantage of people. It's very easy for that kind of collusion to break down when you're talking about more than a couple of people. It depends on how many actors there are. And another thing that you could do if you wanted to check to see, you can use a margin analysis. I mean, I don't think anybody is going to do this. You could go along the supply chain and, ask each person when they're buying and selling that good along the supply chain, how much did they buy their input for and how much did they sell their product for, all the way through. And then when you see a big blip, you can hone in on that spot in the chain and ask the questions why. So that's another way that you can better understand how these margins are getting made.
Mm-hmm. Okay, we're gonna do one more. Oops, give you the answer. So casual labor. Drought has displaced a large rural agricultural population from their land and into the city. The local wages being offered to casual day laborers in urban areas is observed to drop sharply, causing tension between the residents and incomers. So what's happening here with supply? It's increased. Why are you saying it's up? Oh, can you speak into your mic?
If you have more day laborers than you did previously, more in the urban environment.
What's happening to demand? Staying the same, or we don't know? Yeah. And then what about price? Wages drop, right? So it's decreasing. So again, demand may be normal, or we don't have information. Supply is excessive, so all these laborers are moving from the rural area to an urban area. So it may be that the system is oversaturated, right? So now we have more supply available and no change in demand. So what would I do? That's a good question. What kind of drought has displaced a large rural population from their land into the city? I mean, you could do an intervention where you either find kind of alternative livelihood sources so that you're not saturating one livelihood market. Off the top of my head, I could think of that. So again, that would kind of decrease that excessive supply. Okay.
Yeah, usually that kind of thing is that would be common in response. Migration is a common response to conflict or also to a drought. And so in those contexts where people are congregating, temporary labor opportunities, creating temporary labor opportunities through such things like cash for work could be useful, or cash for training, or something else. So creating temporary labor opportunities is good.
Yeah. So we have a couple of others, but I think you guys got the point of, again, just looking at the information you're hearing from people and then understanding, kind of breaking it down to what does this mean about, how does this kind of impact supply, demand, what is the change or impact on prices, what's happening to volumes of things. So just kind of thinking about that. I'm going to play another quick video that kind of puts all of this into perspective very nicely.
Supplying aid in an emergency used to be mainly bringing in ships, planes, trucks, transporting items from overseas, and then distributing to beneficiaries. In this way of working, the supply chain looks something like this. But often this can bypass what was already in the area, the local market system.
Whatever we do in an emergency has an impact on markets. But bypassing the local market and only bringing in materials from outside can impact prices, availability, access, and can even cause local traders to go out of business. Where markets are functioning after a crisis, giving cash or vouchers can be an effective tool to get assistance to beneficiaries.
For all kinds of things, like food, household items, water, shelter, and even medicine.
And this can boost local markets, increasing trade.
But what happens when we give a beneficiary cash without understanding the market? What if they go to their local trader only to find there are no goods on the shelves?
Let's roll back the clock a little.
Let's say the beneficiary and the small trader are in a slum on the outskirts of the city. The trader gets their goods from different places.
The household goods come from a distributor who brings a small truck into the market once a week.
The distributor gets them from a large store in the capital city by road once a month.
Some of the food in the shop comes from big supermarkets who get it from wholesalers,
who get it from millers and producers. And some of the food comes from farmers who grow on plots of land nearby.
So you see, for each type of commodity, there's a complicated market system to get to know. We need to understand all the pieces of the puzzle, the whole supply chain, to know which way to work in an emergency. And these chains can be vulnerable and can take time to be affected. Goods might be on the shelves for now, but what about in a month?
Let's go back to the small trader. Remember, they get their household goods once a week from the distribution truck. But what if there are fuel shortages after the emergency and the truck driver can't get diesel anymore?
Or what about further up the chain? Things might work okay for a few weeks, but what if a bridge is damaged? This will have a knock-on effect to the small trader down the line.
And can put at risk the delivery of our project to beneficiaries in need.
So what does all this mean? Well, when we work with cash, there's still a supply chain to engage in, and we need to work with others to monitor the supply chain, making sure beneficiaries can access what they need.
And we need to be agile enough
to switch back to delivering directly if the market system isn't functioning or takes a turn for the worse.
And when it's functioning again, we can switch back to delivering the local market system.
We all want to make the right decisions in an emergency and have the most impact. That means we need to get to know our local market system, monitor while we're delivering, and maintain our own supply chain for when it's needed.
So that's just to kind of, again, emphasize that we're kind of looking, I like how it puts it nicely, we're looking at that entire, even though, visibly there's one piece of the puzzle that's affected, we have to also look at kind of the entire piece of that puzzle, that entire puzzle to see what's happening with all those other pieces, whether they're also affected, whether they're partially affected, or whether they're not affected at all, and we can leverage that possibly. So just kind of a couple of key messages here. Again, please don't say markets are functioning or are not functioning, right? And this is something that we also have to kind of change how we program some of our tools and speak of our analysis. In one of the things before we decide to do a cash intervention, there's a variety of criteria we look at, and we look at security, capacity of the local Red Cross to implement such a program, and then we also look at markets. And then one of the kind of prompting questions for markets is, are they functioning or not functioning? And this is not to say that you can't say yes, they're functioning, no, they're not functioning, but provide the detail, right? So don't just say yes or no, but say, well, they're kind of slightly disrupted, and specifically these are the parts of the system that are disrupted or where we're seeing blockages in the market. Also, again, a point that Jenny had made earlier was, think about just kind of the before, during, and the future, the projection, right? So if you're going to a disaster affected area immediately in the aftermath of, of an earthquake, of a flood, of whatever disaster it is, more than likely you're going to come to the ground and see that everything is, it's not functioning. Shops are closed. There's no one around, no people who are buying, people who are not buying. So just also be able to anticipate, like observe the changes over time. So, are people coming back one or two couple days after the earthquake or 2 weeks after the earthquake? Are people starting to set shop? Because more than likely, again, these are people's livelihoods. So it's not like they're just going to completely abandon things. Things will start picking up more often. So it's really more about kind of monitoring that, how quickly how quickly is the market kind of recovering or reaching its pre-disaster situation? Is it a slower kind of a slower recovery or a very quick recovery? So again, just provide the detail. Again, your project is only likely to cause significant inflation if supply cannot respond sufficiently to demand. So again, we talked about kind of some of the key things to look at as you're doing your market assessment, and looking at, again, competition, integration, what's happening with demand, what's happening with people's purchasing power. And also, don't feel intimidated by, having to do this, or if you're going out on a deployment or an operation, or even just wanting to understand it. No one is expecting you, and a lot of these kind of tools and thinking has been designed for people who are not market experts. I'm not a market expert. Jenny's not a market expert. Wendy's not a market expert. So this is literally like a lot of these tools and thinking is just to kind of help you break it down into just simple ways about thinking about your intervention, and how to think about markets. So just if you're in a situation where you want to give this a try, or you're deployed and you're going to work on this, feel free to reach out to us. There's also in the as part of the Cash Learning Partnership, there's a listserv for kind of called Markets in Crisis, and you literally can get emails all the time. If you sign up for the listserv, you'll see someone saying, look, I'm in Niger and I'm in Niger and, I would like to know if anyone's conducted a market assessment, or I am in Ecuador and I'm curious to see what organizations are, looking at this product and what the situation is. So you'll kind of, or like if anyone has any quick methodologies to conduct a market assessment. So there's a lot of resources available. So don't ever feel if you're in a situation where you have to start thinking of this, that you're kind of on your own, and good luck with that. So that's just to kind of let you know not to be kind of intimidated. Give this, start, I would say kind of embrace it, and it's actually quite interesting. And the more you kind of are able to put some of this into practice, the more some of this kind of sinks in. Okay, market tools that are available. This will be kind of the last thing we cover in today's market session. So in terms of market tools that are available, there are a lot of them available. And in this session, I'm mainly just going to talk about the RAM and the MAG, which are Red Cross movement tools. But for all of these other tools, you can go online, and there's a lot of resources to talk you through the tools. The EMA, for example, the Emergency Market Mapping Analysis, has a dedicated website where you can download the entire EMA toolkit. It also has tabs on when they're having trainings on EMA, and it's quite comprehensive, and kind of walks you again step by step with this type of analysis. The Cash Learning Partnership, if you go on their website and look at their market section, they actually have a very kind of neat handout that basically analyzes or gives you a breakdown of all of these different market assessment tools, and just shows what they kind of have in common, what some tools might have that others don't. And in essence, it's just really, most of them are tackling kind of the same questions, just in a different way or a different format of presenting them. So this is kind of just a view of the RAM and the MAG. You can literally type RAM IFRC online or MAG IFRC online, and then you'll have this available in a PDF version, and it kind of walks you through how to conduct a rapid market assessment or this kind of longer term market analysis guide. There's also in the IFRC learning platform, there's a course online for the RAM. It's only, I think it's like 40 minutes to take it, and it walks you through the entire toolkit. And it's actually, it breaks it down in a very kind of digestible, user-friendly way. So it kind of takes you, step 1, you should do this. Step 2, you should do this. And it provides all the templates and guidance. So highly recommended. And I had mentioned before in terms of how these tools are used. So usually the RAM is the tool that we use for an emergency market assessment immediately after a shock. And it's going to kind of inform our assessment and our response options analysis. And then the MAG is kind of more for analyzing kind of, or doing a market assessment to inform the entire project cycle and to keep in mind for our entire project cycle. So again, when we were talking about just differences, Ava, you were asking earlier how long it takes to complete. So kind of the official response is 1 to 3 days, but it honestly will depend on the resources you have available on the ground. And then yes, the information you have on the RAM, again, the RAM is a very quick snapshot of the market situation post-disaster. So it's going to be kind of useful maybe 4 to 6, maybe a little longer weeks after a shock. But then if you want something, 6 months into a disaster, then you might want to look at a more longer-term market assessment. Any questions, comments on this? And these tools, again, are available. They're accessible online. The IFRC learning platform has a training on the RAM, and they're quite user-friendly, I would say, and break things down very easily. Okay. So with that, we end our market session. So we looked at markets, what are markets, market systems, how to do market analysis, and then some of the market tools that are available. Any questions, comments, concerns? Any thoughts on markets? Anything to share? Has anyone done a market assessment? Jenny, is there anything online from the chat?
Nope, I'm not seeing anything. Folks are making cricket noises.
Cricket. Okay, then with that, we end our market session. I know it was a little heavy and there's a lot of information, but market assessments are interesting. They're fun to do. They can be intimidating. I mean, I will be completely honest with you. This is still, something not necessarily, I wouldn't say not my favorite topic. I find it very interesting. But the first time I had to go do that one, I was very intimidated by like what I'm supposed to, and I kept on thinking, oh my goodness, if I get this wrong, this is going to completely, ruin the intervention or completely have, causes negative domino effect. But as soon as, you get on the ground and you just start getting a sense of, what's happening post-disaster? What are consumers telling us about prices, about goods, whether they can access them? Even that in itself will kind of start triggering those kind of follow-on questions and research that you need to do to get the fuller picture of the market. Okay, well, thank you guys for participating. And Jenny, can you remind us when our next Cash Learning series is and what we're covering? I believe it's
Yes.
August 7th.
Yeah, it's next week, August 7th, and you, Mariana, will be delivering a session on targeting and
Transfer value, right?
And transfer value, yes.
Correct. So yes, August 7th, same place, same time. We'll talk about targeting and transfer value. Perfect. Okay, so thank you guys. I'm gonna exit out of the Zoom or stop recording. And thank you guys for your participation.
Thanks so much, Mariana. Excellent feedback, and I will send out a wrap-up email with a few notes for the parts that we didn't record.
Okay, perfect. Thank you.